Welcome to the Genealogy Radio Show, the radio show that's keeping you in the loop. And we air from beautiful Kilkee, Radio Corkabashkin, and we've got part 2 of the Marks Carroll brief and the lovely Janet on air today again, telling us the big legacy of what's happening with the Carrolls and workers' rights and the life in an urban centre and the things that happened in her family that lend itself to research for you in sources and so on. So it's a combined effort of how we look at what we see in a social context and what we can derive from the sources once we get them, that they're not just flat two-dimensional records and that they bring the people to life at that time. And I'll be talking a little bit about AI as well, artificial enhancements of photographs and what we did for some of our photographs and what depth that gave us for likenesses and bits and pieces. So welcome, Janet, again to the show for part 2.
Hi, Lorna. Thanks very much, Lorna. Lovely to be here with you again.
And Janet, we're going to talk about Michael Meehan and an unusual case that he had, which was a compensation case, because I know that was very interesting to us in the 1930s. And he'd had an accident and received and won his appeal of compensation. And tell us a little bit about that, what your thoughts were on that.
He did, Lorna. There in 1933, I have it here. I'm just going to have a look at it for you. And Michael Carroll, he suffered a stone in his eye while working in a quarry. And the county council tried to deny that he was employed by them. And they accused Michael of working on his own behalf. And however, Michael took the county council to court and he won. Now, I suppose it was rare at the time in the 1930s. As we know, the working conditions in the 1930s was not the best, but the county council appealed this win and they lost. And Michael hung on to his compensation.
Which was considerable because it lasted, I think, to the rest of his life, didn't it?
It did, yeah. I think it was part of his wages for the rest of his days, wasn't it, in the county council?
Absolutely. And it was significant because what we found was it was published in so many of the national newspapers. So it wasn't just in the Croom newspaper or the Limerick newspapers. We found it as far as the Kerry newspapers and so on.
Yeah, I have the transcript from 1891, which was in the Evening Herald,
well, it was later, it was the 1930s.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, 1930s. And that in the High Court, about it going to the High Court and that they had appealed it and that they had actually lost that appeal, the county council. So, and I suppose the working conditions back in the 1930s.
Well, I know a little bit about the working conditions in the 1930s. You could, I think about 1936 or 37, take a week off for holidays, but you weren't paid. So holiday pay wasn't paid. Mm-hmm. So you could have the time off, but no money for it. So very few people ever went on holidays then. Yeah. There was no leave, if you like, annual leave as we enjoy today. And that must have, like the hours that people worked were phenomenal. So they worked 6 days a week. They might have had a half a day off. If they were servants, they had a half day off, never of a Saturday or Sunday. It would always be a weekday, maybe a half day on a Wednesday. And often the shops followed suit with that because that would be why there was half days in shops in the towns and that, because of course that was the servants' day off. And Sundays weren't open for shops in towns and bits and pieces, but it was something, I suppose, that reflected the domestic service life of upstairs, downstairs world of retail, and that very much came in. But Michael was a fascinating character in the fact that he had such tenacity and he didn't even show up in court on the appeal but won it, which was an incredible feat. So he must have had some good legal counsel and access to it at the time. So we were impressed by that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And he had, I'd say it wasn't his first or second time in court either, Lorna. I think he was well versed at that stage.
Absolutely. He was a veteran at being a defendant and on both sides, complainant and defendant and so on. So he really did know the rigors of the law. And one of the things that we found was Michael's sister, who their mother died with her in Limerick City, probably went to stay with her and when she was sick as a widow and bits and pieces. And the thing about it was that we then found records in Mount St. Lawrence Cemetery in Limerick City, which are freely available online to you all. So you just might note that Limerick City has some of the best records I've seen in genealogy for the entire country. Limerick Local Studies is amazing. And if you're doing genealogy, you're really spoiled when you have Limerick records and Limerick origins. Tell us a little bit what you did about St. Lawrence.
Yeah, so Michael Carroll, alias Meehan, he was married to Anna Gleason, and they had 5 children that we have here: Edmund, Mary, Margaret, Edward, and Michael, of course, who went on to be my grandfather. So Mary married
Yes, his sister. Sorry. So the naming pattern can be very confusing. There's so many Michaels and Marys. Michael had a sister Mary, and he also had a daughter Mary.
But she married in Limerick City.
His sister, Michael's sister, married in Limerick City, and she was buried then in Mount St. Lawrence.
Mount St. Lawrence. So we went online to find this, and we found a picture of her grave in Mount St. Lawrence. And as you, if you don't know Mount St. Lawrence, it's split into an old graveyard and a new graveyard. So we guessed it was probably in the old graveyard, given the year. And we went up there, my sister and my sister-in-law and myself, and we went up there to have a look around. And I suppose it's not a graveyard I've had to go to before, because most of my ancestors are Croom. But when we got there and saw the size of it, and we were, God, we're going to be here for the day. But as it turned out, the caretaker had just pulled up, and I said to him, look, I have a picture. Do you think you'd have an idea as to where it is? There's a tree behind it, what have you? So we found it. He found it for us. Now it took a bit of time, but we did find it, and it was great to find it. You just felt that kind of connection, right? I found someone in my family, and it was lovely. And we took some photographs of it, and and that was lovely to have in my ancestry book as well, that this connection is here up in Mount St. Lawrence. And I could tell that the grave is being kept well. So there's obviously cousins of mine that are looking after it, and I would be in saying all this, Lorna, I have no problem giving my email if anybody thinks they might be connected in contacting, Carroll's Marks,
brilliant.
If they think they're connected in any way.
The show goes out worldwide, so that's a really loving, caring thing to do, because that's how we make the networks. We're able to the worst thing is if you find someone and you find connections and they're like, oh, I don't want to talk about it, I don't want to do anything, because it doesn't lend itself to another line in the family being developed and so on. So it is wonderful that we have, and you're an expert on Croom as well, which is absolutely fantastic, because that's a landscape that could be very difficult to decipher without that level of expertise. You grew up in it, you knew where everything was, you knew what the lanes were, and so on. And
that's, because really some of the names that are here will say, Cornelius, he married Margaret Meehan first, right? There's Meehan still existing in Croom. His second wife was an Elizabeth Frawley. Now there's Frawleys still living in Croom, and so I suppose if we went back far enough and we'd find all the connections there, eventually.
Exactly. And one of the things that we would have looked at was the kind of things that dictated businesses. So we've got things that are considered crime in the 1900s that aren't considered crime today. So for example, It's not a crime to have a drink all day Sunday in a pub today.
Yeah, but and we did find that, didn't we, in the petty court sessions? Michael Carroll, or alias Meehan,
being a found on was quite significant. You ended up in court.
He found where intoxicating liquor is licensed to be sold during and within such premises, required to be closed by 7:30 p.m. on a Sunday. The pubs were meant to be closed by 7:30, and if you were found in there, you got a hefty fine at the time,
Absolutely.
But that was dismissed within a month. That that particular one was dismissed. Yeah,
which was unusual in itself. A lot of the cases did tend to be dismissed against Michael, which is something that we found surprising, because either he was extremely lucky or he was poaching salmon, and there was salmon going to the high table of the judges and the bits and pieces. We could infer that there was some type of transaction passing hands, because he was just too lucky in some ways of not going to jail.
And he actually did go to jail a couple of times.
Yes, but he didn't go. He did for the time of being a repeat offender would be, you know, something that would have been recidivism, would have not been looked on favorably. So
he was fined £1 on one occasion, and he was in default of that payment, and did 14 days, 2 weeks.
Yes, in jail. That's right. Yeah. So we did have where it was kind of an unusual landscape in the fact that we did find that he was being pulled for things, for like his stepson was living with him, Michael Fitzgerald. She had married a widow with a child who had lost all her other children, had not survived except the one child in that relationship. And
that's right.
You know, he was loving, because he was being done for the fact that this guy wasn't going to school, but I think there was a record of the child poaching as well, you know. I mean, but he was obviously spending time with this young man, if you like, at this time, because school age was not like it is now, up to the year of 18. You were finished school, I would say, all your schooling by 11, 12 years of age. So that's significance in the fact that the period of education for our ancestors was 6 years. That's what they had in education. So, and that's relatively recent times. The day of the long school year. I remember school, I'm still very surprised at school starting back in August, because school never started back in August. It was always around the 10th or the 9th of September. It was never in August. I never heard of anyone starting back in August. So we had 2 very fine months of holidays, you know, in primary school, and nearly 3 months in secondary school, which was the envy of our English cousins who had 6 weeks. And we're moving more into that model of 6 weeks now and so on. So it's a very telling differences in what's happening with school and the educational system and so on. So like there were all those things that we could notice, of things that happened then and things that happen now. We would have had petty court sessions over clothing, over arguments over clothing. So clothing was passed on, and clothing was seen as an asset. It wasn't seen as just something temporary, because clothing took so long to make and so on. So,
and something else we found out, Lorna, do you remember we were saying about it wasn't a judge that was ruling these were justice of the peace or something like that, wasn't it? That would have been overseeing these petty court sessions.
Yes, exactly. And the system doesn't dramatically change with independence. It does start to change after it, though, because we're going into being a new state. So there's a lot to be discovered in 1922 website of the digital, what it's going to tell us, and the difference between the old world and the new. The old world of being under a being a colony and being under British rule, and the new world of not. And that's very significant. And that's what we're going to see with I'm really looking forward to the 1926 census. And I'd hope and love it if it came out earlier rather than later, because it's such a benefit to visitors and tourists coming and what they can find about their ancestry, that it adds another layer of wonderful information as to what's happening in our new state. So I would hope that we had a petition there for the release of it, and that we could have the release of it at that time. And was there anything else that struck you, Janet, in your legacy of your family journey?
The part, I suppose, the part that Croom Workhouse played in the village. You know, it was a lot of people died there. They were born and died there. You know, it's a very historical building.
And it
as
became a
such.
hospital as well.
It did. I mean, it's Croom Hospital, Orthopaedic Hospital now, but the Fever Hospital at the back of it, that old building is still there, you know. And it was interesting, you know, when I suppose, found how many of my family had gone through the place, to drive actually down there, because I suppose I lived there all my life as a child, and you never thought, oh, well, it never interested me as such, you know. But I suppose once we started researching the family history, I was interested then to go down and see this building and, you know, think of the conditions they were in. And not much has changed. Looking at it, you could see the poverty in it, the greyness of it, you know. And to go down and see the building and think, oh God, you know, I lost a lot of my family through that place, you know. And I suppose the sadness that went through there, you know, a lot of children died there, and you'd often see, you know, present at the death, and it might none of the family might have been present at the person's death, which was sad.
Yes, it was. And that would tell you that if it was a fever, there was a contagion issue. So we've just gone through that with COVID-19, where our people have had to die alone, which they never would have before.
That's it, you know.
And it brings it home to you how savage that was, because we have experienced that over the last year and a half.
It does, yeah, because, you know, we saw a lot of the witnesses on these death certs, you know, they were no relation. They were people that worked there. And like that, I suppose, here we are, you know, 2021, and what the year we've gone through, the year and a half we've gone through, really, I suppose nearly 2 years at this stage.
Yeah.
But, you know, of people gone back to that time where people cannot come and see you and hold your hand as you die. And that's quite sad to think, you know.
Yeah,
the way things have turned.
Very poignant, and it is. It's something that we never understood, the fact that people couldn't travel to these far off places or couldn't get there. Mm-hmm. So once they left their houses, they never saw their loved ones again, you know.
Yeah, and like I said to you, I had a lot of ancestors in Waterford and that like that. And I suppose going to Waterford was half a day's journey back then, you know.
Exactly.
You know, so, you know, and here we were in our time, and we found we couldn't go to Waterford, and we have cars, you know, and that kind of the way you were disconnected from members of your family, and how hard that must have been to be so disconnected from them
all the time. Yeah, and I suppose that's one wonderful things of the project, which we did with the help of the students from UL who were on placement with me at Merriman Research, and who did such a superb job of doing everything that they were asked to do. They really helped us with this project tremendously in the research line, and we had many late hours of looking up everything and putting everything together and collating it. And Janet, I just want to thank you for your time today, and for the wonderful sources that we found and uncovered. And I know our listeners are going to love this show, and we're happy to provide further help on what we used and what we sourced on this. And so,
Lorna, could I give you my email address there? And if anybody feels they're
connected, if they contact the radio station, we'll make sure that it's freely available out on air. And rather than we don't do it through air. But ladies,
thank you, Lorna. Thank you very much for all the work you put in, because it was such fun doing it, even though it was all virtual and we were all on Zoom, and I had my cousins in the UK. I was able to bring them in on those meetings, and it was
a new way of working. It was a revolutionary way of working. It changed the whole way,
you know. But it was fabulous to be able to involve them from the UK.
Exactly,
you know.
And it's rather than it being a stagnant platform of emails, it became a vibrant space of being able to, well, hold on, have you thought of this, or I found this, and so on. So
it was fabulous. Thank you.
Thank you very much for listening, listeners. And the show is podcast out on a Sunday and repeated on a Sunday at 2:00, and podcast out after. So we've got, you know, our series is just growing and growing in for Radio Corcabashkin, and we're concentrating very much on place for the series for the 2021 series. I think we're on series 14 now, and we've been going for over 7 years, which is some legacy. So we've looked at Croom and Waterford through our last 2 shows, and the names of Carroll and Marks. And I really want to thank Janet for her time today. It really has been appreciated. So that's all for now, folks.